This is Delegate Julie Polakovich-Carr, representing Rockville and Gaithersburg in Montgomery County. You're listening to the Conduit Street Podcast, the official podcast of the Maryland Association of Counties.
Hello and welcome to the Conduit Street Podcast. This is Michael Sanderson, and joining me today is Brianna January from the MACO policy team. Welcome, Brianna.
Thanks, Michael. Glad to be here and really excited to talk about some interesting blueprint updates from this week.
All right, so blueprint updates it is. That is the order of the day. A lot's been happening there. And honestly, I feel like this podcast, we kind of cut our teeth on back when it was the Kirwan Commission, and we were talking about excellence in education and revising what we expected of our public schools and what we want to deliver for our school children. Back when it was a commission forming all those visions, and then it turned into legislation and a legislative debate, and now we're in the implementation phases. But this stuff has been interesting and complicated from the get-go, and we decided early, we at Conduit Street really felt like this was worth spending time to sort of break this stuff down, follow those meetings step by step, and sort of nerd out on this stuff. And I don't know, maybe that's been our lane ever since, is nerd cred. So we are back for more, and I'm excited about it.
Well, I am glad to be counted as one of those nerds now. And, this week was really a big one for everyone that's been invested in the huge blueprint rollout. I mean, the Accountability and Implementation Board, also known as the AIB more lovingly, they formally updated their planning document, their big statewide guiding document for how the locals and the Department of Education should implement and really monitor the blueprint. And so they've made some pretty big changes after a huge stakeholder process. And also, just the week before, late last week, the AIB actually signed off on all 24 local school systems' own implementation plans. So those plans that, they plan to follow for this upcoming school year on how to start implementing various aspects of the blueprint into each jurisdiction. So all 24 made the cut, which is really huge. A couple of them do need to make a few technical fixes here and there, but everyone is ready to go for a very quickly approaching school year. I can't believe that we're already at that point.
Right. So that's the reason we wanted to have this conversation, to kind of talk through what these changes and refinements look like. But let's start by, for our listeners, sort of framing this whole accountability infrastructure was a very deliberate part of the blueprint. And it's definitely one of the things that the Kirwan Commission, all these blue ribbon stakeholders in education and outcomes and so forth, that everybody wanted to say, if we're going to make this big investment in public education and we're going to ask so much more of what we do in the schools and what the teachers can and should deliver and what the students ought to expect, that we want to make sure that along with the money comes some degree of sort of navigation, that we want to have. You mentioned the AIB, the Accountability and Implementation Board, that didn't exist before the blueprint bill passed. So this is sort of a new frontier for Maryland to have all of this apparatus installed just to make sure that we are pointed in the right direction, that each of the systems is pointed in the right direction. And this idea of stakeholder feedback to continue to guide the program as it rolls out, this is as intended, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. The AIB is basically this new statewide independent authority that will evaluate blueprint implementation and different aspects of progress, and then hold both the state Department of Education, as well as each 24 local education systems accountable based on progress and how the blueprint is going and what sort of goals and measures we're seeing from implementation. So it's a 7-person board. It's rather small. But those 7 people do represent different regions and demographics. They all have expertise in education and education policy. There are several teachers themselves or school administration officials that are on the board. And as a matter of fact, our listeners will be happy to hear that former Montgomery County executive and past MACo president, Ike Leggett, is the chair of the board. So he's leading the charge. And our listeners will also recognize this name, Rachel Heist. She's former DLS education expert and really the architect of the whole blueprint plan. She's fittingly the executive director of the AIB, and they are rapidly expanding their staff for various aspects of implementation and technical assistance and all of that good stuff. But they're really established at this point, and they are starting to look at the local plans, the state plan, and to see where they can offer assistance and guidance based on the blueprint law.
Right. So this part of the plan is working basically as intended, and no one is surprised that if over the course of the last few years we've had some shocks to the system of delivering all public services, education included, and labor market changes as a result of the pandemic and so forth. So you need a course correction, but probably wisely, Maryland built in this kind of system to have the implementation board have a role in what are we going to measure, what are we expecting at various times and so forth. Some of this is written firmly into law, but some of it is in the hands of the implementation board and in the reports and plans that are coming from the local schools. So that's what we want to get into today. And let me offer a note for our county government listeners, because as we kind of know, the county governments have a partial role in public education, but it's a deliberately limited one. So it's not your board of county commissioners who are making decisions about whether we're going to teach Portuguese or Latin in the public schools. All those decisions about investments at the small scale level in the school system, all that's done by your board of education and the superintendents and principals and the folks who are implementing public education on the ground. It's not your county council making that judgment. It's not your county executive or the county budget. Those things are being done by the school systems. And that's why they're the ones who are developing those local plans, albeit each county had an implementation coordinator role that was jointly appointed by the county governments because the state wanted the counties to have some sort of skin in the game, right?
Right. Yeah, that's exactly right. And those roles are all set up at this point. All 24 should be in place and working.
Yeah. So what we're going to talk about today is basically how we're rolling out the plan. But what this conversation is not going to be, if you're a county official and you're thinking, okay, what I really want to hear is, are they changing the timetable for when we have to spend these dollars? Or, I'm looking at my budget for next year and saying, I don't have any idea how to afford this, or I don't know how we're going to be able to do the dollars this way, or are they looking at the wealth formula? All these sorts of things that are, candidly, they're coming up in MACo's conversations with our member counties. Those things are written into state law, and it would be in the General Assembly's hands if they wanted to make any alterations to the timetables or the big picture expectations of the blueprint. So this isn't that conversation. This isn't really about money per se. It's about expectations and measurements and the process of getting to that, right?
Right. That's definitely not this. The big story here is more on the expectations and goals of the blueprint, measuring them throughout the progress of implementation, and really what operational steps the state needs to take, whether it be the department or the AIB, and also what each local school system is doing, and all, of course, in pursuit of those blueprint goals that are laid out directly in the law and then tweaked by the AIB.
Right. So for our listeners, Brianna has written a pretty thorough article on the Conduit Street blog this week. We've published it in our series of deep dives where we take a topic that we think is worthy of more than just the sort of passing casual treatment. she dug deep and excerpted elements from the materials of this last meeting of the AIB. So if you're looking for sort of the docent guided tour through the museum, the person who can take you to each exhibit and sort of say, here's the big takeaway. Oh, now let's go over here and let's take a look at this. Brianna has already done that for you. And then we're going to kind of do a version of that on the podcast today. If you want a little bit deeper, check out the blog item, and we will link to that in the show notes. And if you want to go super deep, I believe the meetings of AIB are available on YouTube channel on their website, right?
Yes, that's exactly right. And blueprint docent, that's an added title I might add to my to my resume.
That's not bad, right? Okay, so let's kind of go piece by piece through this. I thought it was an interesting article, and I will play the role of the interested reader, and then you can fill in the blanks a little bit. So let's kind of talk about this piece by piece. I'll go in the order that you wrote it up, which I suspect was sort of in the order of the materials and their conversation. But
exactly right.
All right, so let's start with English language learners. We know that one of the elements of the blueprint was, the whole structure of the way we fund schools in Maryland is we mostly fund per pupil. And then we say we recognize that there are categories of students that are harder to reach or more expensive to teach. And it's appropriate to count those students as more than 1.0 student. And English language learners are one of those special categories where it makes sense to say, we need more resources to help those kids. They're entitled to an education, but there's a broader gap that you need to bridge. So they fit into the funding formulas and so forth. They're one of the areas where Maryland wants to do better. That's one of the pieces that the AIB touched on in their report this week. Talk about that.
Yeah, exactly. The implementation plan from the AIB overall does focus on English learners, especially with the new and deeper emphasis in the blueprint. But this week's updates, there are basically several new and deeper requirements from the Department of Education regarding things like collecting data at different points about English learners, collecting and reporting on progress that the local school systems are implementing specific programs for English learners, the sort of thing that you would want to know anyway. And so the AIB has kind of laid out with these updates some specifics on how that should be done. But I will note that that's pretty much all on the responsibility of the state here. So looking at a lot of statewide data on English learners. And Michael, I'll also just note as an aside, you did mention per pupil funding, but there's also, with a deeper emphasis on English learners in the blueprint, there's also additional add-on incentives for capital projects that in some way, shape, or form might expand or create dedicated space for English learners. So our listeners should tuck that away. But that came out of some legislation a couple of years ago that MACo had a big hand in.
Right. Okay. So appreciate the add on there. But I think what our listeners probably want to gather here is that this isn't breaking new ground. It's not like, well, we want to introduce whole new concepts or categories into the blueprint. This is the AIB saying, based on what we've been hearing from a number of invested stakeholders, we don't think we're collecting enough data on this front. We want to make sure we're advancing our offerings for English learners, and let's measure it in the following way that's a little broader and more specific than what they had laid out previously. So that's the general flavor of what this report is going to be about, which is maybe not as sexy as will completely change the direction of the whole thing. But again, this is as it was designed. This is supposed to be, let's continue to steer the ship rather than just shove it off and see where we land in 10 years.
Right. I mean, with such a big goal of the blueprint being around English learners, we have to know where we're starting from and where we're going. And I will note that these particular updates from the AIB do come directly from a work group that was focused on English learners. And so, we have everything from the department creating a framework to even measure and collect specific data around English learners. So really kind of knowing where we are and where we're going.
Okay. All right. Got it. That helps kick us off. Now let's talk about one of the topics that is on just about everybody's mind, I think. It was a big element of the original Kirwan Commission vision and certainly has been on the minds of policymakers. This is early childhood education, pre-kindergarten offerings, and so forth. Now, a big tenet of the plan was to make sure that, over time, we want to make sure we offer a free seat in public pre-K for students, for basically needy families who have 4-year-olds and 3-year-olds, and eventually expand that so we've got a free seat for everybody who wants one. A variety of things have happened on the way toward that goal, and this is an area where the AIB sort of had to take a finger in the breeze and say where we are isn't exactly where we expected to be at this point. So let's change some timetables and expectations a little bit. Walk us through that a little bit.
Yeah, as you mentioned, huge concern for both locals and the state, a major component of the blueprint. Well, with this week's updates to the AIB's big implementation plan, the board basically clarified that MSDE cannot require certain early childhood certifications for folks working in the industry before the 2027-2028 school year. Now, it seems like it's far away, but this is actually what's directly intended by the AIB and by the General Assembly. Previously, the blueprint law basically said that pre-K teachers had to be certified or enrolled in a certification program and making progress in that program beginning in the 2025-2026 school year. But just this last legislative session, the General Assembly, acknowledging that we're having a provider shortage and that there are lots of challenges and logistics to setting up or expanding pre-K programs in particular, the General Assembly took that feedback and knowledge, and they extended that deadline from the 2025 to 2026 school year to instead 2027, 2028. So this update is really a reflection of that and that intention. But that basically meant that when the General Assembly passed that bill last year, that did have kind of a buffer time, and it allowed MSDE to have discretion for those few years in requiring certifications before 2027. The AIB basically said, no, we want to offer a buffer time where programs can actually set up and expand, and you can be working on your certification. But in the meantime, the department cannot require those certifications, with the understanding that there are just lots of challenges to even getting those certifications. So this is clarifying the role of the department here, but also that, we have to start setting up these programs. We've got to start hiring people, and folks can be working towards certification, but we're not going to require it until 2027, 2028, which is what all of our leadership in Annapolis had intended.
Okay, so the AIB sort of playing referee here a little bit about this big complicated law has all these different provisions, but here's what we really mean. And these dicta from the AIB will sort of lay out timetables and hopefully resolve some of this ambiguity. I will say, the issue of how to get to the offerings for pre-K that were envisioned in the blueprint, it is one of these big asterisk issues. And we've been hearing this on the ground, that we haven't had the giant groundswell of private daycare providers flocking to the state to say, hey, I want to go through this full certification process. I want to go through the STARS rating system and whatnot so I can become an official pre-K educator. I think that was one of the suppositions of this plan, was that we'd be able to convert a lot of people who were in just home-based daycare, turn them into licensed providers who have passed some tests and gotten some training and that sort of stuff. And they can be the ones providing, turning those room with 8 kids into a classroom with 8 kids where they can check the box and accomplish the things that we want out of true pre-kindergarten education. Short of that, we have a gigantic space problem. Like, where would we put scores and scores of new, nursery school kids? Sorry, that's using my generation's term for pre-kindergarten, but what are we going to do with all these 4 and 3-year-olds who showed up and said, I want my free pre-K seat? And we're like, well, we literally don't have a building to set up a classroom of 32 kids in this town. So anyway, we've got some time to get from here to there. And some of this is, I think, a practical recognition that you've got to have space and seats before you can make good on that delivery.
Yeah, absolutely. And Michael, I'll add that at our summer conference coming up in just 2 weeks' time in Ocean City, we actually have a whole panel dedicated to that exact issue. I'm calling it kind of the capital opportunities and challenges to pre-K expansion, looking at space, looking at dedicated facilities, as well as financial challenges and opportunities. So readers should definitely attend if you're planning to see us in Ocean City, because that's going to be a lively discussion. And we've got the leading experts to chat, including the executive director of the Interagency Commission on School Construction, the IAC, who's really in charge of figuring out space.
Right. So perfect plug. And once again, it's the MACO conference where you need to be to plug in for all the conversations that are happening in Annapolis, in county seats, and across Maryland. That's our job, to read the room and bring that relevant and timely content. And once again, this is what everyone's talking about, and this is what we'll be talking about at the MACO conference. So hashtag MACOCon, you got to be there. Otherwise, you're going to miss the whole show. So thank you for the quick plug there. Okay, you've already mentioned that the AIB has done a review and effectively has signed off on these county by county, the 24 school system level plans for their own implementation. That was part of their engagement this week as well. You want to get into that a little bit further and what they see as an ongoing role between the local plans and the state?
Yeah, absolutely. Some really great updates from this last week in that big statewide implementation plan. The AIB added language to directly clarify and specify exactly its role in providing technical assistance, whether it be to the Department of Education, other state agencies that might have a hand in some of the blueprint aspects, as well as directly to all 24 counties and our local school systems. So the AIB has clarified throughout their CIP support for developing plans, implementing aspects of plans at different times. They also added a requirement that basically stated that the AIB and MSDE will jointly develop a framework of sorts to help identify areas of technical assistance. So that's really great. It's going to be a good forward-thinking framework of kind of predicting the different technical assistance needs for various aspects of implementation. That framework will actually be updated annually according to the AIB's updates here. So constantly looking and seeing where the locals are needing help and how they can do so. And Michael, I'll also add that the AIB did also update their implementation plan to basically say that they have to approve or disapprove or provide extra feedback and tweaks to the different local implementation plans by December 1 annually. Previously, the date was July 1. They've moved that to December 1, which, that gives additional time for the upcoming school year by having that a little bit earlier. So really good stuff to come from that. I think that these updates in particular will end up playing out to be some of the most significant because it really clarifies the AIB's role as well as what's expected from the Department of Education when it comes to partnership and collaboration on various aspects of the blueprint with the locals. So really good stuff there and more to come with what that framework will eventually look like. We'll surely report on that once it's available.
Right. So you don't want to have the lack of deep resources in a smaller school system mean that their plan doesn't handle complex issues because they may have to. So bring in the experts at the state level for technical assistance where that's needed, like lay that out that's an entitlement. If you need help from the state, they're duty bound to offer it. And then changing the timetable just seems like mechanically it's got to be the school systems who said, approval in July 1 and late refinements leaves us just a few weeks before the next school year starts. Let's do this in the winter so we've got months to ratchet up and alter the following year's budget if need be, all that sort of stuff. So that all that just like passes a smell test. We should be doing the planning out of the cycle of the budget rather than right after we've adopted the year's budget.
Yeah, and I'll also add, Michael, I failed to mention that the updated language also states that not only will the AIB and the Department of Education offer assistance, but if a local school system comes to either body and says, look, we're having trouble with XYZ, we need your help, this new updated language says that the department and the AIB are required to then provide that. So that's really huge. That's great for our locals.
Right. And that's presumably taking stakeholder input. Like that's got to have come from the local systems saying, we want that assurance that we'll get help. If we send the distress call, then someone's going to answer it. Right. And that's sensible.
Exactly.
Okay,
that's good policy.
Right. So we know that this whole plan includes a whole lot of desired outcomes and things we're supposed to be tracking and measuring along the way. This week's report kind of gets into that and the phrasing of that and so forth. I don't have a great read on how big of a deal this is, but tell us about goals and measures and the terminology that they're suggesting here.
Yeah. So throughout their comprehensive implementation plan, the AIB this week has updated some language that previously said outcomes or outputs, and instead updated that to say goals. It's hard to completely read the tea leaves and to know if this is signaling a change in expectations. But those of us with some sort of background in program management and evaluation might raise an eyebrow here. Typically, goals are a bit of a softer landing, really, when it comes to outputs and outcomes, or compared to, I should say. They are, after all, what a project or program is aiming for and not necessarily what is reached. So whether or not this is kind of a softening of tone, I think will be determined, but it is interesting, the changing and nuances of language here. And those of us with any sort of basic background and training in program evaluation will know that there is a difference in defining those terms. So We'll see.
Right. But I guess, there's a little bit of context here. There are times when the General Assembly can, in fact, say that there's an absolute requirement to do A, B, C. Like if you're a grant recipient for these kinds of funds under this particular program, you shall do the following, or else you no longer get the grant. Right? That's a reasonably common thing. Sometimes they will make requirements like that on us in local governments, and we'll have, usually a constructive back and forth about whether they ought to be a mandate or a requirement as opposed to a goal or a measurement and that sort of thing. You can't really do that. You may have aspirations for what we're going to accomplish in public education, but you can't exactly say, this school shall have 85% of this students at this grade pass this test, right? You can't say you shall do such a thing. You can say we're going to measure the following things, or we have these aspirations and goals. So I don't know, we're already in an area that isn't a fit for an absolute requirement like some other areas of law sometimes are, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Yeah. Okay, so there's some other sort of broad issues here. I thought it was an interesting element in what you wrote up, and I bet you the AIB spent some real time talking about this, was with teachers, and how do you indicate how we're doing better with the teachers and other educators who are part of service delivery in the schools. That's a tough thing to measure. There are some really simple measures, like how many people have an advanced degree or have gotten a certification from this entity or that entity. Like those are some things you can just calculate. But then the AIB talked about some softer measurements here too, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And this did actually bring quite a bit of discussion from the AIB, more than any of the other updates that we've already discussed. Even this took up a bit of time for this week's meeting. Yeah. The idea here was to develop a framework to monitor different aspects of teacher, what they're calling holistic quality. So things like cultural competency, trainings, professional growth and development, things that are really subjective, and whether or not you can measure it is going to depend on a lot of different factors. So the AIB added an update to their comprehensive implementation plan, originally stating that they will develop this framework and monitor these indicators. After a lot of discussion about really their capacity to do so, and just the overall feasibility of doing so, the AIB instead landed on agreeing that they may, in the future, develop and monitor these sort of holistic indicators of teacher and administrative quality. So they're not requiring that they do so, because it might be too big of a lift, especially right now. But they are very much acknowledging that this is important. This data will matter, and kind of these different indicators of teacher quality will also play into kind of the way that the blueprint plays out at the local level, and possibly some of our different outcomes and goals that we are looking for. So more to come on that, but it was a really interesting discussion. I'd encourage our listeners, if you watch any of the special meeting from this week, this section was really interesting, and it was just good to hear the different perspectives on doing so and what that might look like.
Yeah, it seems to me what we're kind of getting into there, and I don't claim to be an expert, but this smells a little like this phrase you hear from education generally about teach to the test, that you sometimes are afraid of. If you put all your eggs in the basket of how do the kids do on this one performance, then you end up with an incentive to let's just make sure the kids can take that one test and do well on it, because that's the only thing we're measuring. So in this case, if the only thing we measured are how many of your students or how many of your teachers have a master's degree and how many of them have gotten this particular professional certification, then you've kind of sent a message to the school system: just push all your teachers into that certification program, and as many as possible into getting this master's degree. And then you're going to look like you've got great teachers. Even if in your judgment, we think our teachers, what they really need is this sort of companion skill. We need this mentoring program. We need them to get this cultural competency. We think those are the things that are going to give us the most bang for the buck. But if those aren't being measured and valued by the folks who want to bring about all the best things in our schools, then if that's not being rewarded, then you may not want to do it. So that's got to be part of this conversation. Is it should be more nuanced than just what percent A and what percent B. Right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And it's going to take this sort of deliberation takes greater thought and discussion than just a little update to the implementation plan. So an ongoing conversation for the AIB to have, and I'm sure with multiple stakeholders as well. But we'll see what they come up with if they decide to eventually.
Okay, so then for a reader like me, as I was reading through your breakdown of this report and these various findings from the latest meeting, I felt like we got into the fine print. And then there's a lot more material in there, written stuff around the various implementation considerations as sort of a catch-all category for other things we're going to be doing and checking as this program gets rolled out. And then some more detail on other things that we think are worth tracking and measuring and how we plan to do that. There's some detail in your article, which I think our listeners can get into. Are there things that you'd like to highlight there that are kind of worth noting in particular?
Yeah, just our listeners should just know that these updates do add a bunch of new tracking and data collection and reporting requirements for the Department of Education, mostly complementary data to various blueprint goals, things that just make sense to collect and analyze and report on for the public. But there are no additional reporting burdens from our local school systems or county governments. So that's really key here. just a lot of stuff that makes sense to report on and things that will help guide future implementation and really see where we're going with blueprint progress. So
right.
Like you mentioned, the blog kind of gets into what those details are. We don't have to go into them here, but there are a lot of really useful things coming out of that update.
Right. And I did notice a whole segment of the additional information is about career and technical education, which for some feels like the piece that folks don't talk enough about. But I know we have a lot of folks in the county community and in the education community who feel very strongly that this needs to be part of the overall picture. And, the goals of the blueprint, one of these central tenets of the blueprint is we want to have our kids college and career ready by the end of 10th grade. So we can do more internships. We can do more cross education with our 2-year colleges, with community colleges across the state. We can get students into in-work positions and so forth if they're on a career track as opposed to a college track. And there's more measuring and I think accountability that we're making strides on that front as well, which I think will be music to an awful lot of people's ears as well.
Absolutely. And at Mako, we do a lot of advocacy and education around exactly that. So I encourage our folks, if they're particularly interested in CTE, to look at our blog and even past podcasts, and more to come, right. I'm sure, on that front.
Good. Okay, so a busy week or two for folks who are enthusiasts for great public education. And that is what Maryland has its sights set on, is how do we get from doing a good job to a great job? How do we deliver more for our school children? Some of the devil is in the details, and having a body like the AIB, to sort of shepherd this progress and bring things along, point things in the correct direction, and candidly make some course corrections when things have been off kilter because of the weird labor market or because of the pandemic or other things that are become sort of external influences. So any other observations that you'd like to wrap up with that we didn't get into, just sort of walking through that blog piece? You sat through the whole meeting and took furious notes, I'm sure, through the whole thing. Any other big picture observations to share?
No, I think that we pretty much covered it. And, as always with these sort of things, more to come. And we will be sure to keep our folks in County Universe updated as the AIB makes more progress.
Right. So if what we have done is got you interested in this topic, then you owe it to yourself. Number one, we will put in the show notes a link to Brianna's blog item from today or from this week. That kind of lays out the elements of this last meeting. It's got links to all sorts of different items. So if you're hungry for more and you're a rabbit hole kind of person, if you're like me, you can go to Wikipedia and link your way for the next thing. It's an hour and 45 minutes later. If you're that guy like I am, then her blog article will be a perfect starting place. The next thing you have to do is, if for some ridiculous reason you're not yet registered for the Mako conference, you got to get down to the Mako conference. We're going to have to be covering all these issues from the workforce angle, from the county government angle, talking about early childhood education and pre-K with the stakeholders. We're going to have Rachel Heiss from the AIB in the room. We're going to have education leaders in the room, legislators leaders in the room, and all the county budget and fiscal people talking about multiple things, including the blueprint. So all these topics are front and center at the Mako conference, as you would expect. So you got to get your way down there. And finally, stay tuned to all this stuff. Keep on the podcast and follow the Conduit Street blog, because these topics are front and center and very much on the minds of our county leaders. So with that, let's wrap up one more walk down Conduit Street. As always, if you enjoy this podcast, and we hope you do, please subscribe. And that way, all the episodes will be delivered directly to the device of your choice. And go ahead and smash that 5-star review, right? That's the best. 5-star. That's what you want to give us. That way, tell the world that they should be listening as well. That's the best way for us to get the word out. And we welcome your help on that front. You can also follow along Mako with the social media, follow Facebook, and that thing I'm still calling Twitter, although apparently it's a 1-letter thing now. Anyway, And of course, follow the Conduit Street blog. We can have those articles sent to your inbox as well. For Brianna January, this is Michael Sanderson signing off, and we will talk to you soon.